Silas Fenwick slammed the paper down on the table so hard the coffee cups rattled. "Sign it," he said, "or I take everything." Eliza Whitmore didn't flinch, but her hands, hidden beneath the table, were shaking so badly she had to press them flat against her thighs just to keep them still. She was 31 years old, had managed 40 acres of timberland alone for 3 years since her father died, had never once asked this man for a single thing. And here he was, sitting in her kitchen, in her house, on her land, telling her to sign over her life like it was a minor inconvenience to him. "You have until Friday," Silas said, already standing, already buttoning his coat like the conversation was finished. "The judge will see things my way. They always do." He left. And the silence he left behind was the loudest thing Eliza had ever heard. If you've ever had someone try to take something from you that was never theirs to begin with, stay right here because this story is for you. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Stories like this one come through this channel every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. It costs nothing and it means everything. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because what Eliza did next changed everything. The morning Eliza Whitmore walked to Lone Cedar Ranch, she had exactly 4 days left. 4 days before a Dalton County judge would sit behind a heavy oak desk, read a petition filed by her uncle Silas Fenwick, and decide, based on carefully selected words written by a man who had never once loved her, that she was incapable of managing her own affairs. 4 days before the land her father bled for would legally become Silas's problem to manage. She hadn't slept. You could tell by looking at her, the smudges beneath her eyes, the way her jaw was set too tight, the way she walked like someone bracing for a blow that hadn't landed yet. She wore her good coat, the brown wool one she kept for town visits, and she'd pinned her hair back neat. Not because she wanted to look pretty, because she wanted to look serious. She wanted the man at the end of that road to look at her and see someone worth listening to. Carter Voss was known in Dalton County the way certain mountains are known, by their outline, not their interior. People said he was quiet. People said he kept to himself. Some said he was strange or cold or simply uninterested in human company. His ranch hands respected him without quite understanding him. His neighbors nodded to him at the feed store and felt somehow relieved when he nodded back. Eliza had spoken to him exactly twice in her life. Once at her father's funeral, where Carter had stood at the back of the churchyard and said only, "Your father was a fair man." And once at the county land office 3 years ago, where they'd been waiting in the same line and he'd let her go ahead of him without being asked. She wasn't coming to him because she knew him. She was coming to him because she had run out of every other option. She went through the list again as she walked, the way she'd been going through it for 3 days straight, wearing grooves in her thinking like wagon wheels in wet mud. Her father's lawyer was old and tired and quietly afraid of Silas. The banker in town owed Silas a favor she couldn't see around. The other ranchers in the county either didn't want the trouble or couldn't afford to care. She had friends, real ones, but friendship didn't override a judge's signature on a legal document. What she needed was a husband. The law in Dalton County, as it stood in that particular year of that particular era, was a thing built mostly by men for the convenience of other men. A single woman, even one who had managed property responsibly for years, could be declared legally incapable of handling her own affairs if a male relative petitioned the court and brought 2 witnesses. Silas had the petition, he had the witnesses, bought and paid for, Eliza was certain, though she couldn't prove it yet. He had the judge's ear. He had, frankly, the entire architecture of the county's legal system leaning slightly in his favor, simply because of how it had been designed. But there was a hole in his plan. A married woman's property rights in Dalton County were attached to her husband's legal standing, which meant that if Eliza were married, legitimately, with a certificate and witnesses and everything proper, Silas's guardianship petition became worthless. You couldn't declare a married woman legally incapable of managing her affairs. Her husband's existence answered the court's concern before it was even raised. It was a horrible solution, Eliza knew that. She wasn't naive about what she was contemplating. She was proposing to legally bind her life to a man she barely knew in order to keep land that already belonged to her. The injustice of it made her stomach turn every time she thought about it too directly. But Silas had forced her into a corner, and Eliza Whitmore had never been the kind of woman who stayed in corners. She pushed open the gate at Lone Cedar Ranch at just past sunrise. Carter was on the porch. He didn't look surprised to see her, which was its own kind of unnerving thing. He was sitting with a mug in both hands, watching the eastern tree line the way men who've lived alone for a long time learn to watch things, quietly, without need of explanation. He was older than her by maybe a decade, with a face that looked like it had made peace with weather and trouble in roughly equal measure. He didn't stand, but he didn't look away either. Eliza stopped at the base of the porch steps. She had prepared a speech. She had written parts of it down and then burned the paper because she didn't want to sound like she was reading. She had practiced it walking here, had adjusted the order of her points, had decided she would be clear and direct and businesslike, and she would not cry. She absolutely would not cry. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I'm going to ask you something that will sound like it came from a woman who's lost her mind. I want you to hear me out before you answer." Carter looked at her over the rim of his mug. "All right," he said. "My uncle Silas Fenwick has filed a petition with Judge Alderman to have me declared legally incompetent. He's going to claim I'm not capable of managing my father's land. What he actually wants is the timber rights and the 40 acres. I have 4 days before the hearing." She took a breath. "The only way to stop the petition is if I'm married. A husband makes the guardianship claim irrelevant under county law. I'm not asking you to—" "Yes," Carter said. She stopped. He said it so quietly, so simply, that for a moment she thought she'd misheard him. The word had barely any weight to it, like he was agreeing to pass the salt. "I haven't finished explaining," Eliza said. "I know what you're asking." He set his mug down on the porch rail. "And I said yes." She stood there at the bottom of his steps and felt the entire carefully constructed speech she'd prepared dissolve in her mouth. She'd had arguments ready, reassurances, a proposed list of terms. She'd been prepared for him to say no, or to bargain, or to ask uncomfortable questions, or to look at her the way some men looked at her when she talked, like they were waiting for her to stop so they could explain something to her. She had not been prepared for yes before she finished the sentence. "Why?" she finally said. It came out more bluntly than she intended. Carter was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet. Thinking quiet. There was a difference, and Eliza, who had learned to read silences the way some people read faces, noticed it. "Your uncle came to me 4 months ago," he said. "Wanted to buy your land. Said you were about to lose it, and I could get a good deal on the timber rights if I moved quickly." He paused. "He told me you were struggling, couldn't keep up with the accounts. Wasn't fit to be running property alone." Eliza felt heat climb up the back of her neck. Of course. Of course Silas had already been here. Of course he'd been working the edges of her life long before she even knew he was circling. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I told him I wasn't interested." Carter's voice didn't change, didn't color with pride or satisfaction. He said it the way he might say he'd declined a second helping at dinner. "And then I looked into the land records, because what he said didn't match what I'd heard about how your father kept things." "You checked the land records?" "I did." "Why?" He looked at her with something that wasn't quite patience, but was close to it. "Because a man who lies about one thing is usually lying about others, and I don't like being used as a piece in someone else's game." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. There was something disorienting about this, about having found, apparently by accident, a man who had already seen through her uncle's scheming and simply refused it. No drama, no rescue fantasy, just refusal, quiet and flat, like shutting a door on the cold. "This would be a legal arrangement," she said, because she needed to say it. I'm not asking you to—" She stopped and started again. "I want to be honest about what this is." "So do I," Carter said. "You keep your land. Your decisions stay yours. I don't want your property, and I don't want to run your life. I've got enough to manage here." He picked up his mug again. "That clear enough?" "That's—" She paused. "That's remarkably clear, yes." "Then we ought to go see Pastor." "No, you'll want the justice of the peace," he said, already thinking practically, already several steps ahead in the logistics of the thing. "Quicker. And we'll need 2 witnesses who won't talk to your uncle before Friday." "I have 2, Eliza said. "People from town, trustworthy ones." He nodded. "Then I'll be ready to leave by 8. She should have felt relief. She did feel relief, somewhere underneath everything else. But what she felt more immediately, standing at the base of those porch steps in the early morning light, was something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like someone had looked at her and seen exactly what she was. Not a problem to be managed, not a woman who needed handling, just a capable person in a difficult situation, asking for help with clear eyes. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't a fairy tale. Nothing about it was clean or comfortable or what she'd imagined when she was younger and thought about what a marriage would look like. But it was honest. And after 3 years of fighting Silas Fenwick's particular brand of lying, honest felt like water after a very long drought. She walked home to gather what she needed. She didn't cry until she was halfway down the road, out of sight of the ranch, and then she stopped herself after about 30 seconds because she had too much to do and crying wasn't going to be useful right now. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist and kept walking. That was Eliza Whitmore. Practical, even in the moments that weren't. The justice of the peace in Dalton County was a man named Roy Tilden, who had been witnessing legal transactions for so long that very little surprised him anymore. He looked up when Eliza and Carter came through his door that afternoon, noted their witnesses. May Halstead and Old Drum Cooney, both of whom Eliza trusted completely, glanced at the clock and reached for the proper forms without asking many questions. Carter signed his name in the same careful, unhurried way he seemed to do everything. Eliza signed hers and noticed her handwriting was shakier than usual. She didn't comment on it. Roy Tilden stamped the document, handed over the certificate, and said, "Congratulations," with the particular neutrality of a man who has said that word 5,000 times and means it neither more nor less than the occasion requires. Walking out into the afternoon light with a marriage certificate in her hand felt surreal in a way Eliza hadn't anticipated. She'd been so focused on the mechanics of the plan, get to Carter, convince him, make it legal before Friday, that she hadn't left room to think about how it would actually feel. That was, she started. Practical, Carter said. Yes, she almost laughed. That's exactly what it was. They stood on the street outside Roy Tilden's office for a moment. May Halstead gave Eliza a look that said approximately 14 different things at once, most of them complicated. Drum Cooney shook Carter's hand with genuine warmth and said, "You're a good man, Carter Voss," in a voice that made it sound like this was something he'd believed for a long time and was glad to finally have occasion to say. Carter accepted this with a nod and said, "Keep it quiet until after Friday." "Already forgotten," Drum said. "What?" Silas Fenwick did not know. That was the part Eliza kept returning to as she spent the next 3 days going through her father's papers, organizing the land records, and preparing everything she would need if the hearing still happened. Though she suspected, once Silas's lawyer presented the guardianship petition and the judge checked the marital status of the subject in question, the hearing would be very short. She was right about that. She was also right about what Silas's face would look like when he found out. She wasn't in the room for the moment he learned. The hearing was brief and procedural, and Carter stood beside her at the back while the judge reviewed the petition, noted her marital status, and dismissed the filing in the sort of flat, official tone that carries no sympathy in any direction. But she watched her uncle's lawyer across the room, watched the man lean to whisper in Silas's ear, watched Silas's expression shift through confusion to calculation to a cold, settling fury. He didn't explode. That wasn't Silas's way. He was too controlled for that, too practiced at managing how he appeared. He simply went very still, the way water goes still before it starts moving somewhere dangerous. He turned and looked at Eliza. She looked back. She had spent years being afraid of that look. The flat, assessing quality of it. The sense that he was calculating her weaknesses while appearing to do nothing at all. She had spent years making herself smaller around him, being careful about what she said and how she said it, always aware that he had more power and more patience and more connections than she did, and that the wrong word at the wrong moment could make things worse in ways she couldn't predict. She was done with that. She held his gaze until he looked away first. It was a small thing, just eyes across a courtroom, but Eliza felt it in her chest like something that had been locked for a very long time had just, quietly, without ceremony, come open. Outside the courthouse, in the thin spring air, Carter said, "He's going to try again." "I know," Eliza said. "He's not the kind of man who accepts losing gracefully." "No." She watched a buggy go past on the street. But he's not the only kind of man in this county, and I'm not the woman he thought I was. Carter considered this. No, he said after a moment. I don't imagine you are. They walked back toward where the horses were tied, and the afternoon light was long and golden, and the kind of beautiful that the frontier occasionally offers, without warning, like it forgot for a moment to be brutal. Eliza breathed it in. She still had enemies. She still had a fight ahead of her. She was still legally married to a man she'd known for less than a week, which was its own particular category of strange. But she had 4 days ago been standing in her kitchen with shaking hands while her uncle told her to sign her life away. And today she had watched him leave a courthouse empty-handed. For right now, in this moment, that was enough. The days after the courthouse felt quieter than they should have. That was the thing about winning a small battle. It didn't silence anything. It just changed the quality of the waiting. Eliza had spent so long bracing for the hearing, running the scenario forward and backward in her mind, cataloging everything that could go wrong, that when it actually ended, quickly, cleanly, with a judge dismissing the petition in under 10 minutes, she didn't quite know what to do with herself. She went home and sat at her father's desk and looked at the land record she'd spent 3 nights organizing and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running on fear for so long that when the fear lifts, even partially, the body doesn't know how to adjust. Her hands ached, her eyes felt gritty and overused. She made coffee and let it go cold without drinking it. What she kept coming back to was Silas's face. Not the fury. She'd expected that. It was the calculation underneath it. The way his eyes hadn't gone blank with defeat, but had instead seemed to be sorting through something, filing things away, already moving to the next position. She had watched enough of her uncle's quiet maneuvering over the years to know the difference between a man who had been beaten and a man who was simply changing tactics. Silas Fenwick had not been beaten. He had been delayed. Carter knew it too. She could tell by the way he'd said it outside the courthouse, not as a warning, not as an attempt to dampen her relief, but as a plain statement of what they were both already thinking. He's going to try again. Not if. When. The question was how. Butin, living at Lone Cedar Ranch required a period of adjustment that Eliza hadn't fully thought through when she'd walked up those porch steps 6 days ago with a prepared speech and shaking hands. She'd expected practicality. She'd expected distance, maybe. 2 people sharing a legal arrangement and otherwise staying out of each other's way. She'd expected it to feel something like boarding with a stranger, pleasant enough on the surface and fundamentally impersonal underneath. What she hadn't expected was Carter Voss's kitchen at 6 in the morning. He was already up when she came downstairs the first day, which she should have anticipated but somehow hadn't. He had coffee going and was eating toast standing at the counter reading something. A folded letter, some kind of correspondence. And he looked up when she appeared in the doorway and said, "There's coffee," in the same tone he seemed to use for most things, which was to say, informational, without excess. "Thank you," she said. She poured herself a mug and stood on the opposite side of the kitchen, and they were both quiet for a moment, which was its own kind of strange. Not uncomfortable exactly, but unfamiliar. She was not accustomed to sharing morning silence with another person. She had been alone in her father's house for 3 years and had built her mornings around her own particular rhythms, her own sequence of small habits, the specific way she preferred to ease into a day. Carter's kitchen had its own rhythms. Different from hers. Not wrong, just other. "I want to help with the ranch work," she said, after the silence had settled enough to speak into. "I'm not going to sit around being a guest. That's not what I agreed to." He folded the letter and set it on the counter. "What do you know about cattle?" "Enough to be useful. My father kept 12 head for most of my childhood. I can mend fence, I can help with calving if it's that season, I can keep accounts." She paused. "I'm better with accounts than most." "I know," Carter said. She looked at him. "Your father told me," he said, 3 years ago, before he passed. Said you ran his books better than he ever had." Eliza was quiet for a moment. She hadn't known her father talk to Carter Voss about her. The idea of it. Her father, in whatever casual conversation men have at the feed store or the land office, mentioning her in that specific way, sat somewhere in her chest in a place she didn't want to examine too closely right now. "Then you know I'm telling the truth," she said. "Didn't assume you weren't." She drank her coffee. He went back to his letter. And that was, in its own unremarkable way, the beginning of something. Not grand, not cinematic, just two people deciding without ceremony to make the awkward thing work. The ranch hands noticed, of course. There were three of them. A broad-shouldered man named Holt, who had worked for Carter for 7 years and communicated primarily through grunts and surprisingly accurate weather predictions. A younger man called Dewey, who was 19 and trying very hard not to seem like he was 19, and a weathered woman named Pearl, who managed the horses and had opinions about everything and shared most of them freely. Pearl was the first one to speak to Eliza directly. It happened on the third morning, when Eliza was in the stable checking the hoof of a mare that had come in favoring her left front leg the previous evening. She'd found the stone herself, worked it out carefully, and was cleaning the area when Pearl appeared at the stall door and stood watching with her arms crossed. "You've done that before," Pearl said. It wasn't a question. "Since I was about 12, Eliza said. She didn't look up. "Carter said you're good with numbers." "Carter's right." Pearl was quiet for a moment, then, "You're not what I expected." Eliza set down the pick and looked at her. "What did you expect?" "A woman who needed rescuing." Pearl said it straight, without cruelty, but without softening either. "That's the story going around town, that Carter Voss married some woman in trouble to save her land." "That's not entirely wrong," Eliza said. "No, but you're not acting like someone who got saved." Eliza looked at the mare, who had turned her head to nose at Eliza's coat pocket. "Carter didn't save me. He agreed to a legal arrangement that made a bad situation harder for my uncle to exploit. There's a difference." Pearl considered this. "There is," she said after a moment. "That's a good distinction." They didn't become friends that day, but they became something. A mutual recognition, maybe. Two women in a place where women had to establish their usefulness with more evidence and less patience than men, acknowledging each other's competence in the particular way that competent people do when they've both been underestimated enough to recognize the signs. It was a start. What Eliza hadn't anticipated, and what caught her off guard in ways she didn't fully acknowledge even to herself, was how different Carter was from the man she'd expected him to be. She'd expected quiet. She got that. But she'd expected the kind of quiet that is really a form of absence. A man so interior as to be essentially unreachable, speaking only when necessary, present in body, but fundamentally elsewhere. She'd met men like that. Her father's foreman had been one. Her neighbor to the east, old Gerald Marsh, was another. Carter was different. His quiet was attentive. He listened the way very few people listen, not waiting for his turn to speak, not half-formulating his response while you were still mid-sentence, but actually taking in what you said and thinking about it before he responded. It was disconcerting in ways she didn't entirely have words for, because she was accustomed to having to fight for space in a conversation, accustomed to the low-grade effort of making sure she was heard, and with Carter that effort simply wasn't required. It surfaced in small ways, over small things. She mentioned one evening, casually, that the eastern fence line of her property had a section that needed replacing before spring. Her father had noted it in his records, and she'd meant to address it the previous fall, but hadn't had the money. She said it as part of a larger conversation about property maintenance, not as a request for anything. 3 days later, she came in from checking on the mare to find Holt, and Dewey had been sent over to that section with new posts and wire. She found Carter in the barn. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I know," he said, "but it needed doing. I would have managed it." "I'm sure you would have." He didn't say it dismissively. He said it like he genuinely meant it. "But there was no reason for you to manage it alone when we had the hands and the materials." She stood there for a moment with an argument half-formed on her tongue and nowhere useful to direct it. She was used to defending herself against help that was really control-dressed in a different coat, help that came with conditions attached, with the unspoken understanding that accepting it meant surrendering some degree of autonomy. Silas had operated that way for as long as she could remember. Even her father's neighbors, good men most of them, had a way of offering assistance that carried in its undertone the message that they knew better and she should let them handle it. Carter just fixed the fence because it needed fixing, and she'd mentioned it and he had the means to do it. It was almost maddening in how simple it was. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, and hated a little bit how unfamiliar the uncomplicated version of those two words felt. Silas's next move came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the courthouse. Eliza was at the county land office in town, checking the official record of her father's original deed. She'd been meticulous about this, making sure every document was exactly where it should be, every record properly filed and noted. When the clerk, a young man named Hennessy, who had the unfortunate habit of looking at the floor when he was about to say something difficult, told her there had been a visitor the previous week. "What kind of visitor?" Eliza said. Hennessy looked at the floor. "Man named Vale, Marcus Vale. Said he was a land agent, asked to see the records for the Whitmore property." Eliza kept her voice even. "And did he see them?" "It's a public record, Mrs. Voss." He said her married name with a slight hesitation, still adjusting to it. "I couldn't deny access." "I know that. I'm not blaming you, Hennessy. What was he looking at specifically?" "The deed boundaries, the timber rights documentation, and—" He glanced up, then back down. "The old easement records." Eliza went very still. "What old easement records?" "From about 30 years back, before your father bought the property. There was a right-of-way claim filed by the previous owner." Hennessy finally looked at her directly, which meant it was bad. "Vale asked for a copy." She thanked him. She kept her expression neutral until she was outside. Then she stood on the street in the cold air and felt the specific, nauseating sensation of recognizing a trap while you're already standing in it. An easement, a 30-year-old right-of-way claim. Of course, Silas had found something in the historical record, some buried technicality, some dusty filing from before her father even owned the land, and was now in the process of weaponizing it. It was exactly how he worked, not through direct confrontation, which could be defended against, but through paperwork and legal language and documents that looked official and meant whatever the person presenting them needed them to mean until someone looked closely enough to prove otherwise. She went to Carter that evening and told him what Hennessy had said. Carter listened without interrupting. He did that, let you finish the whole thing before he said anything, which was simultaneously helpful and in moments of urgency, vaguely frustrating. "What do you know about the previous owner?" he asked when she was done. "Gerald Holst. He died before my father bought the land. Had no heirs that anyone knew of. The property passed through the county. She'd already been pulling this information forward in her memory, sorting it. My father's deed was clear. I have it. I've looked at it." "A right-of-way claim doesn't affect ownership," Carter said. "It would affect access. They'd be arguing they have the right to use a portion of your land to reach something. The timber." "Most likely." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there any part of that easement record that could be legitimate?" Eliza looked at him. It was a fair question, a hard one, but fair. He wasn't doubting her. He was making sure she'd examined it from every angle, which she needed to do before Marcus Vale showed up with a document and a smile. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need to see the original filing." "Then that's what we do first," Carter said, "before he comes to us with it. We find it, we read it, we understand it better than he does." She looked at him across the table. "You keep saying we. Is that a problem?" She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, not as a deflection but because it was actually something she needed to consider. She had operated alone for 3 years. She had built her strategies alone, kept her own counsel, made her own mistakes, and fixed them herself because there had been no one to fix them with her. The independence wasn't theoretical. It was survival. It was what she'd had. "No," she said finally. "It's not a problem. It's just different. Different from what you're used to. Different from what I'm used to." She paused. "I'll get used to it." Carter looked at her for a moment with that attentive quiet that she was beginning to recognize as his version of warmth. "Take your time," he said. Marcus Vale arrived at Lone Cedar Ranch on a Thursday morning 11 days later. Eliza had been expecting him. She and Carter both had. They'd spent those 11 days doing exactly what Carter had suggested, finding the original easement filing, reading every word of it 3 times each, consulting the deed language. And then, because Eliza had a persistent and probably healthy paranoia about being caught unprepared, going through the county records to find every other easement claim filed under the same previous owner to understand the pattern. She found something. Gerald Holst, it turned out, had filed 3 right-of-way claims in the years before his death. 2 of them had been legitimate, access roads to neighboring properties, properly recorded, properly acknowledged by the relevant parties. The third one was different. It had been filed 2 months before Holst died, at a time when Eliza's research suggested the man had been quite ill, and it covered a timber route that didn't correspond to any road that had ever actually been built or used. It was, in the technical language of legal documentation, a preserved claim, meaning it had been filed but never exercised, which meant, under county law as it stood, that it was eligible to be revived by anyone who could demonstrate a legitimate successor interest, which was almost certainly what Marcus Vale was about to claim. The problem, for Silas, for Vale, for whoever had dug this up and decided it was useful, was that Eliza's father had been aware of it. She found the note buried in the back of a ledger, in her father's particular cramped handwriting: Holst easement, timber route, null per county agreement, 1861, signed out by Judge Harrow. Records at county office. She sat with that note for a long time. Her father had known. He'd dealt with it before she was even born. He'd gotten it properly extinguished through a county agreement signed by a judge, and he'd made a note of it, and then he'd filed it in the back of a ledger where it would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly what they were looking for, including, apparently, Silas's land agent. Marcus Vale was a tall man, well-dressed in the particular way of people who want to project authority without actually having earned it. The coat was too fine for the territory, the boots too clean for the roads. He arrived with a leather satchel and an expression of professional sympathy that Eliza recognized immediately as the kind of expression people put on when they're about to tell you something they know you won't want to hear, and they're enjoying it slightly. He introduced himself at the door with a handshake for Carter and a nod for Eliza that managed to be dismissive without being technically rude. She noted it and filed it away. I represent certain parties with a historic interest in the timber access route that runs through a portion of your property, Vale began, after Carter had shown him to the front room and they'd all sat down. He opened the satchel and produced a document, fresh paper, official-looking, with several signatures at the bottom. This is a notice of revival for an easement filed by one Gerald Holst in 1873, Eliza said. March. The filing number is 0447B. Vale paused. It was a small pause, barely visible, but she caught it. That's correct, he said, slower now. And your clients are claiming successor interest on the grounds that they've acquired property once associated with Gerald Holst's estate. She didn't ask it as a question. That's the substance of the claim, yes. Then I'll save us both some time, Eliza said. She reached into the folder she'd carried into the room and placed a document on the table between them. That's a certified copy of a county agreement dated November 1861, signed by Judge Harrow, extinguishing the Holst easement in question. The original filing was declared null following a formal petition by the property owner at that time, who was my father, Bernard Whitmore. She placed a second document beside the first, and that's the county record confirming the extinguishment from the office of the county clerk. I picked up the certified copy last Tuesday. Vale looked at the documents. He picked up the first one. He read it. He was very still for a long moment. This predates the claim, he said. Not arguing, just saying it, like a man who needs to hear the problem out loud to fully accept it. By 12 years, Eliza said, there is no easement to revive. The claim was extinguished before the revival mechanism your clients are depending on would apply. She kept her voice even, businesslike, the way she'd practiced it in her head every night for the past week. Not triumphant, not angry, just clear. I'm sorry you made the trip, Mr. Vale. Vale set the document down. He looked at Carter, who was sitting slightly to Eliza's left and had said nothing since introducing him at the door. There was something in Vale's look, a searching quality, maybe an expectation that the man in the room would have a different view or would offer some concession his wife wasn't offering. Carter looked back at him with the particular blankness of someone who has nothing to add because the conversation is already over. Vale looked back at Eliza. The professional sympathy was gone from his expression now, replaced by something flatter and less curated. The parties I represent are not accustomed to what? Eliza said. A beat. To being wrong, Vale said after a moment. There was an odd note in his voice, not quite respect, but something adjacent to it, the sound a man makes when he encounters something he didn't plan for. Everyone is wrong sometimes, Eliza said. The question is whether you're willing to let the record show it. She gestured to the documents. These are certified copies. You're welcome to verify them at the county office. If your clients have further questions about the legal status of this property, they're welcome to bring them to the judge who dismissed my uncle's guardianship petition 3 weeks ago. I believe he's already familiar with the situation. Vale put his documents back in his satchel. He stood. He buttoned his coat. And he left Lone Cedar Ranch with the specific, contained dignity of a man who has lost badly and is choosing not to acknowledge it out loud, which was, Eliza supposed, the only kind of dignity available to him at this point. When the sound of his horse had faded down the road, the front room was quiet. Carter looked at her. "The county agreement," he said. "When did you find it?" 9 days ago, in the back of my father's second ledger, behind the livestock records from 1869. She let out a breath she hadn't quite realized she'd been holding. He knew. He dealt with it before I was born, and he kept the note. I almost missed it. But you didn't. No. She looked at the copies still on the table. I didn't. Carter was quiet for a moment. Then, you were ready. I needed to be. She picked up the documents and straightened them, just to have something to do with her hands. He's going to tell Silas today. Silas will know the easement argument failed by tonight. Yes. Which means he'll move on to something else. Yes. She looked at Carter. Does that worry you? He considered the question with his customary unhurried honesty. Not the way it would have before, he said. He's lost twice. He's running out of clean options. The messier his moves get, the easier they are to see coming. That's not entirely reassuring, Eliza said. No, Carter agreed, but it's true. What happened in the days that followed wasn't dramatic. That was something Eliza hadn't anticipated about the aftermath of winning, how ordinary it could look. She and Carter took the documents to the county land office together, filed a formal notation in the property record that clearly marked the 1861 extinguishment, and then went to see the judge who had dismissed the guardianship petition. The judge was a man named Ira Beaumont, who had presided over Dalton County's legal matters for 15 years, and had the demeanor of someone who had seen most human foolishness at least twice and had strong opinions about paperwork. He listened to Eliza's account of Marcus Vale's visit with the careful attention of a man who is building a picture in his mind as you talk. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Silas Fenwick, he said. Not a question, more like a man reading a label on something unpleasant. Yes, sir. This is the second time in a month that your uncle's name has appeared on my desk in connection with your property. I'm aware of that. Beaumont looked at Carter. And you? I'm her husband, Carter said, and she handles her own property affairs. He said it without any particular emphasis, just as a statement of fact, and Eliza felt something shift quietly in her chest. Beaumont looked back at Eliza. I'm going to open an inquiry into the pattern of claims against your property, he said. That's not a promise of any particular outcome. But when a man files a guardianship petition, and 3 weeks later a land agent appears with a revived easement claim against the same property, a pattern is worth examining. Eliza nodded. Thank you, Judge. Thank your father, Beaumont said. If he hadn't kept that note about the 1861 agreement, Vale might have gotten further. He paused. Smart man, Bernard Whitmore. Yes, Eliza said. He was. She said it simply, without the catch she sometimes felt when she mentioned her father. He would have known what to do about Silas. He had always known what to do about Silas, which was, mostly, to document everything and never give him a surface to grip. It was advice he'd given her once, in passing, and she'd carried it without quite understanding it until recently. Keep the records, Eliza. Every piece of paper you throw away is a weapon you've handed to the wrong person. She kept the records. The ride back to Lone Cedar was mostly quiet, the way their rides often were. Eliza didn't mind. She'd stopped expecting that silences between them needed filling. There was something respectful about it, she'd decided. An acknowledgement that the other person was capable of existing in their own thoughts without requiring constant reassurance of your presence. About halfway home, Carter said, You know Beaumont believed you before you even finished. Eliza looked over at him. I know. Not because of the documents. He believed you because of how you presented them. He kept his eyes on the road. There's a difference between someone who found the right records and someone who understands what the records mean. You knew what it meant. That's harder to fake. She was quiet for a moment. Are you complimenting me? I'm making an observation. It sounded like a compliment. He glanced at her sideways. Don't push it. She laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed, really laughed, not just smiled or made the sound people make when something is slightly amusing, since before the courthouse. It surprised her, the way real laughter often does when it's been absent long enough to become unfamiliar. It came out a little rough around the edges, a little startled, like something that had been waiting for the right moment and taken it before she could think too carefully. Carter didn't laugh, but something in his face changed, a very slight softening, barely perceptible, like watching ice at the edge of a stream in the first days of March. There and then carefully, not there. Eliza looked ahead at the road. The sky above the tree line was going pink at the edges, the specific pink of a late afternoon sky when the cold is settling back in and the day is making its exit in a way that is more dignified than it deserves. She thought about Silas, sitting somewhere tonight, learning from Marcus Vale that his easement claim was worthless. Learning that his niece had found the document that killed it before he'd even sent Vale through her door. She thought about her father's ledger, that cramped handwriting in the back pages, the quiet foresight of a man who had known that the most important things were the ones you wrote down and kept. She thought about the inquiry Beaumont had opened, and what it might find, and what it might mean. And she thought about this road, this particular stretch between town and Lone Cedar, which she had been traveling for most of her life without ever imagining it would one day feel like the road home to something other than her own solitary acres. Strange how that happened. Strange what a desperate plan, executed by two imperfect people who barely knew each other, could turn into when neither of them was trying to make it into anything in particular. She didn't say any of that. There wasn't language for it yet, and she wasn't sure there needed to be. Some things were better understood quietly, in the same way that the best kinds of trust were built, not announced, just demonstrated day after day, in the small and unglamorous accumulation of showing up and doing the next necessary thing. The ranch came into view as the last light left the sky. Pearl was in the yard, closing up the stable for the night. She looked up when they rode in, glanced between them with that sharp-eyed assessment she applied to everything, and said nothing. But she nodded to Eliza. A short, specific nod, the kind that meant something between two people who have already established what they're acknowledging. Eliza nodded back. She took care of her own horse that night. She was capable of it. She preferred it. And no one at Lone Cedar Ranch had ever suggested otherwise. That, she thought, was worth more than most people would ever understand. Beaumont's inquiry didn't make noise right away. That was how these things worked in Dalton County. Slowly, quietly. The way water works its way under a foundation before anyone notices the damage. Eliza knew not to expect anything immediate. She'd lived here long enough to understand that the legal machinery of a small frontier county moved at its own pace and couldn't be hurried by anyone who wanted to remain in the judge's good standing, so she waited. And while she waited, she worked. That was the thing about Lone Cedar Ranch in early spring. There was no shortage of work to absorb a restless mind. The calving season was beginning its uncertain, exhausting run, and Eliza found herself pulled into it the way she'd been pulled into cattle work as a girl, the particular focus it required leaving very little room for anything else. You couldn't worry about your uncle's next scheme when you had a heifer in distress at 2 a.m. and the calf was turned wrong, and Dewey was holding the lantern with hands that weren't entirely steady. She'd been at Lone Cedar for 5 weeks by then, and the shape of her days had shifted in ways she hadn't planned and couldn't entirely account for. She still rode over to her own property 3 or 4 mornings a week, checking the timber, checking the boundary markers, making sure the fence Holt and Dewey had repaired was holding in the wet weather. She kept her records there, in her father's desk, in her father's handwriting layered beneath her own. The land was still hers in every sense that mattered, but Lone Cedar had become something it hadn't been in the beginning, familiar. She noticed it one morning when she came downstairs and automatically reached for the second mug instead of the first, because the first was always Carter's and the second was always hers, and she'd apparently learned that without deciding to. A small thing. But it sat with her longer than it should have. She wasn't sure what to do with the small things. She'd been prepared for the large ones, the legal battles, the confrontations, the strategic maneuvering that Silas seemed to treat as a kind of hobby. She'd trained herself for those. The small things were different. The small things had a way of accumulating without permission until they added up to something she hadn't agreed to feel. She put the mug down and told herself to focus on the calving. It was good advice. She mostly took it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days into a cold snap that had come down from the north with the particular rudeness of late-season weather, the kind that arrives after you've started believing spring is actually going to arrive. It was addressed to Carter, which was the first wrong thing about it. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, a formal architectural script, the kind learned in a proper office and practiced until it looked official. Carter looked at it for a moment before opening it, which was unusual enough for Eliza to notice. He opened most correspondence quickly and without ceremony, the way a man does when he's accustomed to mail being functional rather than consequential. He read it. His expression didn't change, but something around his eyes did. A tightening, almost invisible. "What is it?" Eliza asked. He handed it to her. It was from a law firm in the county seat. Not Silas's usual lawyer. A different firm, more established, the kind with 3 surnames on the letterhead. It informed Carter, in the careful language of people who are paid by the word, that their client, one Silas Fenwick, was disputing the validity of the marriage on the grounds that proper notice had not been given to the bride's closest living male relative prior to the ceremony, as required under a seldom referenced provision of the county's marriage regulations dating from 1849. Eliza read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and said very quietly, "He's trying to invalidate the marriage. That's what it says. On a notice requirement." She picked it up again, looking for the specific provision they were citing. A 1849 notice provision. I've never even heard of that provision. "Neither have I," Carter said, which might be the point. She understood what he meant. A law that was obscure enough that almost no one knew it existed was a law that could be presented in a courtroom and sound legitimate before anyone had time to verify whether it actually applied. Silas was buying time, or he was hoping she didn't know enough to challenge it, or both. "He's her uncle, not her father," Carter said. "And your father has been dead for 3 years. If the provision requires notice to a living male relative, he'd argue he qualifies as closest living male relative." Eliza's voice was flat. "He'd argue that even though my father is gone, the obligation transferred to him as the next male in line." She thought for a moment. "It's a stretch. It's a significant legal stretch. Can you make it fail?" She looked at the letter again. The provision number was cited in a footnote. Regulation 14C, Dalton County Marriage Code, enacted 1849. She needed to find that regulation. She needed to read the original language, not the summary in a lawyer's letter designed to present it in the most favorable light for his client. "I need to go to the land office," she said. "They keep the county codes. If they have the original 1849 regulation on file, then you'll know what you're actually dealing with." "Yes." She was already moving, reaching for her coat, running the logic forward in her mind. Carter watched her for a moment. "Eliza." She stopped. "Eat something first," he said. "You haven't had breakfast." She opened her mouth to say that breakfast was not the priority right now, that there was a law firm letter on the table threatening to unravel the only legal protection standing between her and Silas's next move, and that toast was not. Her stomach made a sound. Carter looked at her with the particular patience of a man who has made his point without saying another word. "Fine," she said, and sat back down. The county code office was a small room off the mainland records hall, presided over by a clerk named Adeline Marsh, no relation to old Gerald Marsh, who had the organizational instincts of a military general and the social warmth of someone who had spent 30 years surrounded by filing cabinets and had made her peace with it. She and Eliza had met twice before, both times in professional capacities, and they understood each other in the specific way that women who take their work seriously sometimes understand each other without needing to discuss it. Eliza explained what she needed. Adeline's expression did not change, which was either reassuring or ominous, and Eliza spent the 20 minutes it took Adeline to locate the original 1849 County Code volume trying to decide which. The volume was small, bound in brown leather gone dry with age, and smelled like every old document smelled, like dust and decisions and time. Adeline set it on the reading table and opened it to the relevant section with the practiced ease of someone who knows exactly where everything is and has known for years. Eliza read Regulation 14C. She read it again. Then she sat back in this chair and felt the particular sensation of a problem you've been afraid of turning out to be smaller than you feared. Not gone, not solved, but manageable, workable. The regulation required notice to be given to a bride's father, or, in the father's absence, to her legal guardian, not to the nearest male relative, not to any uncle who decided to nominate himself as relevant, to a legal guardian, a specific, legally designated role that required a court appointment. Silas Fenwick had never been appointed Eliza's legal guardian. He had tried to become one. That was the whole point of the guardianship petition the judge had dismissed 6 weeks ago. But the petition had been dismissed, which meant he had no legal standing under Regulation 14C, which meant the notice provision he was citing didn't apply to him at all. "Can I get a certified copy of this page?" Eliza asked. "I'll have it ready in an hour," Adeline said. Eliza looked up at her. "You already knew this provision, didn't you?" Adeline adjusted her glasses. "I know every provision in that code," she said, with the dignity of someone for whom this is not a boast, but a simple fact. "When you came in asking about 1849 marriage regulations, and Silas Fenwick's name was mentioned in the same sentence, I had a reasonable idea of what you were going to find. Why didn't you just tell me?" "Because you needed to read it yourself," Adeline said. "So you know it, not because someone told you." Eliza looked at her for a moment. "Thank you, Adeline. Come back in an hour." She came back in an hour. She had the certified copy. She spent that hour in the narrow diner 2 blocks from the land office, drinking coffee that was too strong and eating a piece of pie she didn't particularly want because Carter's voice was in her head saying, "Eat something," and she was choosing not to examine why that was true. By the time she rode back to Lone Cedar with the certified copy in her coat pocket, she had already composed in her head the letter she was going to send to the law firm with 3 surnames. Carter was in the barn when she got back. He was working on a piece of tack that had cracked at the buckle, the kind of repair that required patience and good hands, and the willingness to sit with a small problem until it was properly fixed. He didn't look up immediately when she came in, which she'd come to understand was not indifference but focus. He finished the thing he was doing before he shifted attention, because that was how he operated. "Well?" he said when he looked up. She told him. He listened. He looked at the certified copy she handed him. He read it with the methodical attention he brought to documents, not skimming, actually reading it. So he cited a provision that doesn't apply to him because the role it references was never legally assigned to him, Carter said. "Correct. And the dismissal of his guardianship petition is the document that proves it, which Judge Beaumont signed." Carter handed back the certified copy. "He's going to know this fails the moment his lawyers actually read the original language." "He probably already knows," Eliza said. "I don't think he expected it to hold up. I think he expected it to create enough uncertainty, enough legal murkiness, that we'd have to spend time and money fighting it while he figured out his next angle. So this is just interference, expensive interference." She folded the document carefully. "But yes." Carter was quiet for a moment, turning the cracked buckle over in his hands. Then, "He's getting desperate. Or creative. I'm not sure which is more dangerous." "Desperate," Carter said, without hesitation. "Creative people adapt when things don't work. Desperate people start taking risks they shouldn't take." She looked at him. "You sound like you've dealt with someone like him before." He was quiet just long enough to be noticeable. "Once," he said. "Different situation, same kind of man." He set the buckle down. "It didn't end well for him either." She waited to see if he'd say more. He didn't, and she didn't push it. There were territories in Carter Voss that she'd come to understand were his to open or not open in his own time, and pressing them prematurely didn't produce anything useful. He wasn't hiding things maliciously. He was simply someone who had learned, probably through hard experience, to be careful about what he gave away and to whom. She understood that better than she would have admitted to anyone, including herself. "I'll draft the response tonight," she said. "Send it tomorrow." "Good." She turned to go, stopped. "Carter?" "The thing you dealt with before. The similar man." She didn't turn around. "Did you handle it the same way? Documentation, legal channels, all of it?" A pause. "No," he said. "That's why I know documentation and legal channels are better." She thought about that as she walked back to the house. She didn't ask what the other way had looked like. She thought she didn't need to. The response to the law firm went out on Wednesday morning, accompanied by the certified copy of Regulation 14C and the certified copy of Judge Beaumont's dismissal of the guardianship petition, along with a brief and scrupulously polite cover letter from Eliza, making clear that absent a legal guardianship appointment, which did not exist, as evidenced by the attached court document, the provision did not apply, and that any further claim to the contrary would be referred directly to Judge Beaumont's ongoing inquiry into the pattern of legal actions against her property. She mentioned the inquiry deliberately. She wanted them to know she knew about it. She wanted them to tell Silas. Holt took the letter to town for her. He was a man who asked few questions and completed tasks with the reliability of someone who had never once seen the point of doing things halfway. He came back in the early afternoon and said, "Posted," and that was the end of it. Pearl, who had developed the habit of appearing at the edges of conversations she hadn't been invited to and contributing comments of dubious welcome, said from the direction of the stable, "You know he's going to be furious." "I'm counting on it," Eliza said. Pearl considered this. Angry men make mistakes. Yes, they do. As long as the mistakes are legal ones and not the kind that happen at night on a dark road, Pearl said, with the particular directness of someone who has lived on the frontier long enough to have seen both varieties. The comment landed in Eliza's chest like a stone in still water. She'd thought about it. Of course she'd thought about it. She wasn't naive enough to believe that a man like Silas operated exclusively through legal channels when legal channels kept failing. The guardianship petition had failed. The easement claim had failed. The marriage validity challenge was about to fail. At some point, the clean methods ran out. She found Carter that evening and told him what Pearl had said. He didn't dismiss it. That was the thing about Carter. He didn't do the thing that some men did, which was to treat a woman's expression of concern as something to be talked out of rather than taken seriously. He listened to it the way he listened to everything, with the full weight of his attention. "Pearl's not wrong," he said. "We should be more careful." "About what specifically?" "About you writing to your property alone," he said, "and about who knows your patterns." Eliza felt the familiar tightening in her throat that came with the particular combination of knowing someone was right and not wanting to adjust her behavior accordingly. She'd been writing to her property alone her entire life. She'd been managing her own movements, her own schedule, her own choices, without consulting anyone for 3 years straight. The idea of changing that because Silas Fenwick might decide to make his desperation physical was infuriating in the way that so many things connected to Silas were infuriating. Not because they were wrong, but because he was the reason for them. "So he steals my land through the courts, and when that fails, he steals my independence through fear," she said. The bitterness in her voice was more exposed than she usually let things get. "No," Carter said. "That's what it feels like." "I know, but that's not what I'm suggesting." He kept his voice even, not defensive. "I'm not telling you not to go. I'm saying take someone with you for a while, Holt or Pearl or me, not because you can't handle yourself. You've made that clear enough, because there are situations where numbers matter regardless of capability." She looked at him. "You wouldn't ride into an uncertain situation alone if you had the choice," she said. "Would you?" "No," he said, "I wouldn't." The difference between take someone with you and don't go was not small. She'd been offered both kinds of concern over the years, and they felt nothing alike. She recognized the difference even when she didn't want to, even when it was inconvenient to recognize it. "Fine," she said. "I'll take Pearl." Something in Carter's expression shifted, the very slight version of relief that he allowed himself. "Pearl will like that," he said. "She's been wanting an excuse to see the timber. She can see the timber and keep her opinions about it to herself." "That," Carter said, "is not going to happen." He was right. It didn't. Pearl on horseback through Eliza's timber acres was a revelation in the specific way that people who seem contained in one context can be entirely different in another. She was quiet at first, professional quiet, the kind that comes from paying attention to a new environment. And then she started talking. And once she started, she had things to say about the timber quality, the spacing of the stands, the signs of past logging activity in one section of the northern border that Eliza hadn't fully examined. "How do you know timber?" Eliza asked. "Grew up in Oregon Territory," Pearl said. "My father ran a mill." She reached out and ran a hand along the bark of a cedar as they passed. These are old trees. Your father didn't log this stand at all, did he? Not the western section. He said the eastern section was logged once, maybe 20 years before he bought the land, but he never touched the western. Smart man. Pearl looked up through the canopy. You could log part of this sustainably and fund the ranch for a decade, but you'd have to know what you're doing or you'd ruin it. That's what Silas wants, Eliza said. The timber rights. He doesn't care about the land. He cares about what's on it. He'd log it clean, Pearl said. It wasn't a question. In 5 years, he'd have stripped it down to brush. Pearl was quiet for a moment, looking at the trees with the expression of someone for whom that image was genuinely painful. Then it's a good thing you kept it, she said. They rode the boundary slowly, Eliza checking the markers and Pearl noting things with the sharp eye of someone who'd grown up reading forest the way other people read roads. It was good work, useful work, the kind of work that made the land feel real and present rather than abstract. A piece of paper in a courtroom, a line in a document, a thing that people who'd never stood in it wanted to turn into money. It was on the way back, at the eastern edge where the timber thinned into the scrub before the fence line, that Pearl pulled up her horse and said, "Someone's been here." Eliza stopped. "What?" Pearl pointed. It took Eliza a moment to see what she was seeing, a section of undergrowth that had been disturbed, not by weather, but by foot traffic. The kind of disturbance that happens when someone walks through an area repeatedly over a period of days. There were marks in the soft ground near the property marker, partially obscured by recent rain but still visible to someone who knew what they were looking for. "Recent?" Eliza asked. "Within the last week," Pearl said. "Maybe less." She dismounted and crouched, looking at the ground more closely. "2 sets of boots, I think." They were looking at the marker. Eliza felt the cold that had nothing to do with the weather. "Surveying. Or checking." "Checking what?" Pearl stood. Her face was neutral but careful. Whether the marker had been moved, or whether it could be. They looked at each other. The marker was a legal boundary stone, set when her father purchased the property and formally recorded in the county land office. Moving it, or claiming it had been improperly placed, was another avenue of attack. A boundary dispute could cloud the title, drag the property into litigation, create exactly the kind of expensive legal uncertainty that Silas seemed to enjoy generating. "He's looking for a new angle," Eliza said. "Or he's already found one and he's building the groundwork." Eliza dismounted and looked at the marker herself. It was solid, undisturbed, exactly where it should be. She'd checked the survey coordinates herself after Silas's first move, just as her father's habit of thoroughness had taught her. But someone being here, examining it, was information she needed to act on. "We need to get this on record," she said. "The footprints, the disturbance, before more rain comes and covers it." "Do you have any way to record it?" Eliza thought fast. "Hennessy at the land office has an official surveyor's report format. If I can get him out here before the rain, or get a witness statement from you about what we found and when." "I'll give a statement," Pearl said immediately. "Today, if you want." Eliza looked at her. In the months she'd spent fighting her uncle's various maneuvers, she'd learned to recognize the specific value of people who didn't hesitate, who saw what was needed and offered it without waiting to be asked twice. Pearl was one of those people. Carter was another. Drum Cooney and May Halstead had been others, on the day she'd needed witnesses for the marriage. She was building, she realized, without quite having planned to, a small collection of people who could be relied upon. That wasn't nothing. In fact, in a county where Silas had spent decades cultivating his own network of influence, it might be exactly the thing that mattered most. "Today," Eliza said, "we go directly to Hennessy." Hennessy came out the following morning with a surveyor he used for official measurements, a young man named Pratt, who was precise and unhurried and deeply uninterested in the politics of what he was measuring. He documented the boundary marker, confirmed its exact position against the official record, noted the disturbance in the undergrowth in his report, and initialed Pearl's witness statement. The whole thing took 4 hours. By early afternoon, a formal notation had been added to the county land record. Boundary marker confirmed in original position, date of confirmation, names of all parties present. It was, in the technical vocabulary of legal documentation, a prophylactic measure. A thing done not because a problem had yet occurred, but to ensure that when the problem was attempted, the record would already be there to defeat it. When she got home and told Carter what they'd found and what they'd done about it, he was silent for longer than usual. He sent someone to look at the boundary marker, Carter said. That's what the tracks suggest. While we were focused on the marriage challenge, she caught what he was implying. He ran them at the same time. The letter from the law firm was the distraction. The boundary was the actual target. Carter nodded slowly. He's more organized than I've been giving him credit for. He's always been organized, Eliza said. That's what makes him dangerous. He's not impulsive. He plans. She sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of the day finally settling into her shoulders. The marriage challenge and the boundary survey were both started within the same 2-week period. He's not executing one plan. He's running multiple threads at once, hoping one of them catches. But you caught both. This time, she looked at her hands on the table. I need to think about what we haven't thought of. What he might be setting up that we're not seeing yet because we're looking at the things he's shown us. Carter sat down across from her. It was a small thing, just sitting, just being present. But it had weight. Tell me what you know about him, he said. Not the legal moves. Him. How he thinks. She looked up. You've known him your whole life, Carter said. I've met him twice. You understand him in ways I don't, so tell me. It was, she realized, exactly the right question. Not what is he doing, but who is he? Because the tactics changed, but the person didn't, and the person was the only reliable guide to what came next. She took a breath. He doesn't value things, she said. Not really. He values control of things. There's a difference. A person who values something will stop when they've got it. A person who values control of something never stops, because control is about proving you're stronger than the thing, and you have to keep proving it or you've lost it. She paused. My father understood that about him. He used to say that Silas couldn't enjoy anything he had because he was always too busy making sure no one could take it from him. Carter was very still, listening. Which means, Eliza continued, that what drives him isn't really the timber or the land. It's that I have something he decided should be his. He made up his mind a long time ago that my father's property was going to end up in his hands eventually. And every time I block one of his moves, it's not just a setback. It's a challenge to the story he tells himself about who's in charge. She looked at Carter. Men like that don't recalculate. They escalate. The word hung in the kitchen for a moment. Carter said quietly, How far does he escalate? Eliza thought of Pearl's comment about dark roads. She thought of the tracks at the boundary marker, 2 sets of boots belonging to men she didn't know, who had been on her land without her knowledge. I don't know, she said honestly. I've never pushed him this far before. It was not a comfortable answer, but it was the true one, and they'd established early on, without ever saying it in those words, that true answers, even uncomfortable ones, were what they owed each other in this arrangement that had become more than an arrangement. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the cedar trees with a sound like something breathing. Spring was still trying to establish itself against the resistance of a winter that didn't want to let go. The cold came and went and came back again without apology. Eliza looked at the table, at her father's papers, some of which she'd brought over from her property and stacked in one corner because she worked on them here now. At the coffee cups from this morning, still not washed because they'd both been busy, and it hadn't mattered enough to stop for. At the crack in the plaster near the window that Carter kept meaning to fix and hadn't gotten to yet. The ordinary accumulation of a life being lived in a place. She hadn't planned any of this. She hadn't planned Carter Voss or Lone Cedar or Pearl's sharp opinions or Holt's reliable silence or the way she now automatically reached for the second mug. She hadn't planned to find herself sitting at a kitchen table at the end of a hard day with someone she trusted, talking through the psychology of her enemy with the serious attention it deserved. She'd planned a desperate legal solution to a desperate situation. That was all she'd planned. What it had turned into was she didn't have the right word for it yet. She suspected the word would come eventually, in its own time, the way Carter did most things, without announcement, without excess, arriving precisely when it was ready and not a moment before. For now, there was the next morning to prepare for. There was Silas's next move to anticipate. There were records to keep and documents to file and a boundary to protect, and a judge's inquiry that was slowly, carefully, building a picture of a man who had been abusing the county's legal system for his own benefit for longer than anyone had formally acknowledged. There was work. There was always work. Eliza pulled the relevant papers toward her and picked up her pen. Carter got up and washed the coffee cups. Neither of them commented on it. It was just the next necessary thing, done by whoever was in the position to do it, which was also, she thought, a reasonable description of what they'd been building together since the morning she'd walked up his porch steps with a prepared speech and shaking hands. Not perfect, not clean, not what either of them had imagined, but real. Solidly, stubbornly, usefully real. Judge Beaumont's inquiry had been running for 6 weeks when it finally started drawing blood. Eliza learned about it the way she learned about most things in Dalton County, not from an official notification, not from a formal letter with courthouse stationery, but from Adeline Marsh at the county code office, who had the particular gift of knowing everything that moved through the legal machinery of the county approximately 2 days before anyone else did, and occasionally chose to mention it to people she considered worth mentioning things to. "The judge has been pulling records," Adeline said, without looking up from the filing she was doing when Eliza came in on a Thursday morning for an unrelated document. "Property transaction records, specifically the ones involving parties who've done business with your uncle over the past 15 years. Eliza stopped. "How do you know that?" "Because I pulled them for him," Adeline said, with the serenity of someone who sees no reason to be coy about a fact. "He asked me last week. 15 years of county property transactions involving Silas Fenwick or anyone connected to him." She closed the filing drawer. "It's a long list." Eliza absorbed this. "Did he say what he was looking for?" "He didn't need to say." Adeline adjusted her glasses. "When a judge asks for 15 years of a man's transactions, he's either building a picture or confirming one he already has." That was a Thursday, who heard things through his own particular network of old men who sat on feed store porches and talked. The 2 of Silas's longtime business associates had been asked to speak with the judge's clerk. Not summoned, not legally compelled. Asked. The kind of asking that left room to decline, but that only a fool would decline, because the kind of man who declined that particular kind of asking tended to find himself looked at more closely for reasons entirely unrelated to whatever he'd originally been asked about. Neither of them had declined. "He's scared," Carter said, when he told Eliza what Drum had said. "He should be," Eliza said. "Scared men do things they wouldn't do if they were thinking clearly." She looked at him across the kitchen table. It was evening, the kind of still evening that settled over the ranch at the end of a long working day, when everything that needed doing had been done, and the quiet came in like something earned rather than just absent. The lamp was lit. There was coffee. Her papers were stacked at the corner of the table where they always were now, her handwriting filling the pages in the same progression her father's had once filled them. "You keep coming back to that," she said, "to what he does when he's scared." "Because that's where we are now," Carter said. "The first 3 months were about legal maneuvering. That's over. He's out of clean moves and he knows it. What comes next isn't going to look like the rest." She knew he was right. She'd known it since the conversation they'd had after Pearl found the tracks at the boundary marker. The one where she'd laid out how Silas thought, what drove him, the way men who needed control escalated when control was slipping. She'd known it intellectually. Knowing it and watching it materialize in real time were different experiences. "Then we need to be ready for something that doesn't look like the rest," she said. Carter nodded. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a habit she'd noticed, the way he turned things when he was thinking. Small objects moved in circles that he probably wasn't conscious of. "I've been thinking about the timber," he said. "If I were him and I couldn't get the land through the courts, I'd go after the value of the land instead." "What do you mean?" "The timber is what makes your property worth fighting over. The 40 acres without the timber is decent grazing land, nothing exceptional. With the old-growth cedar stands, it's considerably more valuable." He set the cup down. "If someone were to damage the timber, fire, or cutting without authorization, the property value drops. And a property that's dropped in value significantly might be easier to acquire through distressed means." Eliza was very still. Fire. She hadn't thought about fire. She'd been thinking about documents, about legal provisions, about boundary markers and easement filings and marriage regulations from 1849. She hadn't been thinking about the oldest and simplest way to destroy something that grew in the ground. He wouldn't, she said. And then, because she was honest with herself about who her uncle was, would he? I don't know, Carter said. I don't know where his line is, but I think we need to act like we don't know where his line is, which means we can't assume it exists where we'd like it to. She thought about the cedar trees her father had never touched. The western stand, old growth, 100 years of patient growing that couldn't be replaced in any time frame that mattered to a human life. She thought about what Pearl had said. You could log part of this sustainably and fund the ranch for a decade. And the inverse of that, what losing those trees entirely would mean. It made her stomach feel like it had been lined with cold water. What do we do? She said. We watch the timber, Carter said. Starting tonight. Watching the timber meant shifts, and shifts meant telling the ranch hands why, and telling the ranch hands why meant having a conversation that Carter approached with the particular directness he brought to things he considered simply necessary. He gathered Holt, Dewey, and Pearl the following morning and told them plainly that there was a potential threat to the property and that he needed night watches rotated through the timber stands for an indefinite period. He told them it was paid extra, and he told them it was voluntary, and all three of them said they'd do it without asking questions that could have made things complicated. Well, Pearl asked one question. Is it the uncle? She said. We don't know, Carter said. Pearl accepted this with a nod that suggested she knew what we don't know actually meant when said in that particular tone. I'll take the first shift, she said. I sleep light anyway. Dewey looked slightly thrilled in the way of 19-year-olds who have not yet fully internalized that the possibility of genuine danger is distinct from the idea of genuine danger. Holt looked the way Holt always looked, which was to say, present, competent, and deeply unbothered. Eliza took shifts too. Carter raised an objection to this, and she looked at him until the objection subsided, because they had established by this point a fairly efficient system for resolving disagreements that basically amounted to, he expressed the concern, she acknowledged it, and explained why she was doing the thing anyway, and he accepted her explanation without requiring her to justify it further. It wasn't a perfect system. There were nights she came in from a cold watch, feeling like her fingers would never be warm again, and wondered if she'd been stubborn at the expense of sensible. But she kept the timber stand between her and Silas's reach, and that felt necessary in ways that went beyond strategy. It was her land. She was going to stand on it. The first 10 nights of the watch were uneventful, cold, uncomfortable, interrupted sleep for everyone, and nothing to show for it. Dewey started to seem less thrilled. Pearl remained philosophically unbothered. Holt was exactly the same as he'd been at every other task he'd ever been given. On the 11th night, Eliza was on watch in the eastern section when she heard horses. Not one horse, 2, maybe 3, moving without lights, which told her everything she needed to know about the intentions behind them. A person with honest reasons to be near someone else's property at 11 at night could at minimum carry a lantern. People who moved in the dark without lights were not looking to be seen. She didn't panic. She'd spent 11 nights preparing herself for exactly this moment, running through what she would do if it happened, and the preparation paid off in the way that preparation always does. Not by making you calm, because she wasn't calm. Her heart was hitting the inside of her ribs with considerable urgency, but by giving her body something useful to do with the fear, rather than just experiencing it. She fired the agreed signal, 2 shots in the air, spaced wide, and then moved to the tree line to get a better look without putting herself in the open. There were 3 of them. Men on horses, dark coats, moving toward the western timber stand with purpose. One of them was carrying something. She couldn't make out what in the dark, but the shape of it and the way he held it sat wrong in her stomach. She didn't wait to find out what it was. Carter came in from the north side of the property at a run that sounded, in the darkness, like something with more momentum than a single person. He'd brought Holt, who moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been in situations requiring quiet efficiency before and had no drama about it. Pearl came in from the southern trail on horseback. The 3 men had not anticipated being surrounded on 3 sides. They had most likely anticipated an empty timber stand in the middle of the night, because that was what empty timber stands usually were. They weren't. The confrontation was brief and considerably less violent than Eliza had been afraid it might be. When Carter said stop, they stopped. Not because Carter said it with particular ferocity, but because when a man steps out of the tree line already knowing exactly where you are, The calculation about your options changes rapidly. Pearl on horseback at the southern tree line closed the other exit. One of them dropped what he was carrying. It hit the ground with a sound that Eliza recognized after a moment as glass. A bottle, sealed, with what smelled even at a distance like kerosene. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Carter said very quietly, "Get off your horses." They got off their horses. They weren't hired killers. They weren't even particularly frightening men up close. They were laborers, hired hands, the kind of men who did whatever work was available and didn't ask precise questions about the nature of it. The one who'd carried the bottle was the youngest of the three, not much older than Dewey, and he looked at the dropped glass on the ground with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand, too late, the gap between what he'd been paid to do and what it actually meant. Eliza made herself look at all three of them clearly. She needed to see their faces. She needed to remember them. "Who hired you?" she said. The oldest one, a heavy-set man with a beard that needed attention, said nothing. The second one looked at the ground, the youngest one looked at Eliza and then looked away. "I'm going to tell you exactly what happens now," Eliza said. "You are going to leave this property, and tomorrow morning I'm going to ride into town and describe this incident, including the kerosene, to Judge Beaumont. If you were hired to do this, the question the judge is going to ask you is whether you'd rather face consequences for what you were about to do or be a witness in a case involving the man who sent you here." She paused. "Those are different kinds of consequences." Silence. "The bottle is evidence," she continued. "If your fingerprints are on it, and one of them is because you dropped it here, then your denial of being here tonight is not worth very much." She looked at the youngest one, because he was the one who was listening. "Think about that before you decide what to tell the judge." They left. Carter watched them go until the sound of the horses faded completely, and then he stood in the silence of the timber stand for a moment that stretched longer than was strictly necessary. "You handled that well," he said. "Don't," Eliza said. "Don't what?" "Don't tell me I handled it well like you're surprised." Her voice came out sharper than she'd intended. The fear was converting itself into something with an edge now that the immediate threat was gone, which was a thing that happened to her sometimes, and that she didn't entirely like about herself. Carter looked at her for a moment. "I wasn't surprised," he said. "I was saying it because it was true." She took a breath. Let it out. "Sorry." "You don't need to apologize for being angry." "I'm not angry. She stopped, looked at the dropped bottle on the ground between them. "He sent people to burn my father's trees. Trees my father spent 30 years protecting. Trees that are older than anyone I've ever known." Her voice had gone somewhere she hadn't planned for it to go. "He sent people with kerosene to burn something that can never be put back." Carter didn't say anything. He stepped forward and picked up the bottle carefully, wrapping it in the cloth he'd brought from the stable. He'd come prepared for evidence, which meant he'd thought further ahead than she'd given him credit for, and held it without making it into a gesture. "I know," he said. 2 words. But he said them like he meant the whole scope of what she'd said, not just the surface of it, and somehow that was enough to keep her from doing anything she'd regret. Pearl appeared at her shoulder with a lantern. "Dewey's following them to the road," she said, "making sure they actually leave." "Good," Eliza said. "You want to tell me who sent them?" "I don't have proof," Eliza said. "Not yet. But you know." "I know." Pearl looked at the cloth-wrapped bottle in Carter's hands. Her expression went through several things in quick succession, none of which she gave voice to, which was unusual enough for Pearl that it was itself a kind of statement. "I'm glad we were here," she said finally. "So am I," Eliza said. Beaumont's expression. When Eliza laid the cloth-wrapped bottle on his desk the following morning was, for a man of considerable judicial composure, about as close to visible anger as she'd ever seen a judge allow himself in an official setting. He asked her to describe the incident. She described it fully, in the order it happened, without embellishment, and without omitting anything, including the fact that she'd made a speech to the 3 men before sending them away, which he noted with a look that was somewhere between professional disapproval of her not immediately writing for law enforcement and genuine human recognition that the speech had probably been strategically smarter than waiting. He asked if she could identify any of the men. She described all 3 of them as precisely as she could: height, build, approximate age, distinguishing features. She had stood close enough to the youngest one in the lantern light to describe the specific way his jaw was set and the scar on his left hand. She had been, in those minutes in the timber, cataloging. "You've developed the habit of your father," Beaumont said when she finished. "What habit is that?" "Noticing the details others don't bother with." He looked at the bottle. "I'd like to have this examined." "I was hoping you would." He looked at her over his glasses with the expression of a man who is reassessing something. "Mrs. Voss, I want to be clear about where we are. The inquiry I opened into Silas Fenwick's activities has produced a significant amount of material over the past 6 weeks. Property transactions that follow patterns. Witnesses who have been willing, in private, to describe methods of persuasion your uncle used in various dealings. Documentation that suggests a systematic approach to acquiring property through legal manipulation that predates his interest in yours by at least a decade." He paused. "Last night was different in kind, not in document, in action." "I know," Eliza said. "If I can connect those 3 men to your uncle, and the inquiry has given me more resources to draw on than I had 2 months ago, the nature of what he's facing changes substantially." She understood what he was saying. The difference between a man who files bad faith legal claims and a man who sends people to commit arson was, in the eyes of the county's legal framework, not a small difference. It was the difference between a pattern of manipulation and something that could result in criminal charges that had nothing to do with property law. "How long?" she asked. "Days, not weeks," Beaumont said. "We're close enough that I don't want to give him time to move people or destroy anything." She rode home faster than she probably needed to, but nobody was at the road to see it. The days that followed had a quality of suspension to them. Waiting that was different from the other waiting she'd done over the past months, which had been active and strategic, waiting while doing. This was the waiting that comes at the end of a long process, when you've done everything you can do and the outcome is in someone else's hands, and there is nothing left but to live your ordinary days in the space between what has happened and what comes next. She fixed a section of the fence along the northern pasture with Holt on a cold Wednesday. She helped Pearl with a horse that had developed a respiratory problem that turned out to be less serious than it sounded, but required several days of monitoring. She sat at her father's desk on the evening she went to her property and went through the remaining papers she hadn't yet organized, the ones at the bottom of the stacks that she'd been avoiding without quite admitting it. She found, in the second-to-last folder, a letter her father had written and never sent. It was addressed to Silas. She sat with it unopened for a long time, her father's handwriting on the envelope, her uncle's name in that handwriting, something that had been written and then kept for reasons she didn't know and couldn't ask. She opened it. It was dated 4 years ago, 6 months before her father died. It was 3 pages long, in the cramped, careful script her father used when he was writing something he'd thought about for a long time. It laid out, in the patient and specific language of a man who knew his time was getting short, exactly what her father knew about Silas's character, his methods, his intentions toward the property. It named incidents going back decades, things her father had observed, documented, and never confronted Silas about because confrontation had always seemed likely to accelerate rather than prevent. The last paragraph was the one that took her breath. He had written, "I have not sent this because I know it would change nothing about what he intends to do. But I want it on record, even in the record of my own conscience, that I saw clearly what he was, and that I am leaving everything I have built to Eliza because she is the only person I trust to protect it from him. She is more capable than she knows. She is more capable than she has been allowed to know. I hope she gets the chance to find that out." She sat at her father's desk in her father's house and read that paragraph 3 times. She was 31 years old and her father had been dead for 3 years, and he had seen, from the distance of the years he had left, exactly what was coming. He had left her the documents and the habits and the notes in the back of ledgers and had trusted that she would find them when she needed them, because he had known her better than she had sometimes known herself. She didn't cry. She had cried more in the past 4 months than she had in the 3 years since his death, and she had come to the conclusion that grief wasn't linear and didn't finish, and that the moments when it came back weren't failures of recovery, but just what grief was. So she sat with it for the time it required, and then she carefully folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, next to her own heart, which was probably sentimental but which felt necessary. Then she rode back to Lone Cedar. Carter was on the porch when she came up the road. He did that sometimes, not waiting for her. She didn't think he did it deliberately, but ending up outside at the hour she typically returned in the evening, doing something that could be done outside or could equally have been done inside. She had never commented on it because commenting on it would have required naming it, and naming it would have changed it into something more complicated than it currently was. She came up the steps, and he looked at her face the way he sometimes did, reading something there that she hadn't said and that she sometimes wasn't sure was visible. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing new," she said. "I found something at the house, a letter my father wrote." She paused. "It's not relevant to anything. It was something." He looked at her for a moment, the attentive quiet working in him the way it did. "Do you want to tell me about it?" he said. She thought about it. The letter was private in the way that anything between a daughter and her dead father is private. But Carter had stood beside her in every public version of this fight, and he had fixed her fence and watched her timber stand in the cold and carried her evidence to safety in a cloth from his stable, and the thing her father had written about being seen clearly by someone. She thought Carter Voss might understand that particular thing better than most people. "He knew Silas was going to come after the land," she said. "He documented it. He left me everything I needed to fight back, in ledgers and records and case notes. He just didn't tell me he'd done it." "Because he knew you'd find it," Carter said. She looked at him. "That's not a guess," Carter said. "A man leaves tools for someone he believes will know how to use them. He left them for you because he was certain you'd get to them." He held her gaze. He was right. The porch was cold and the sky was doing the thing it did some evenings in late spring when the clouds caught the last light and turned colors that had no right being that vivid in a place this complicated. Eliza leaned against the porch rail and looked at nothing in particular and felt the full accumulated weight of 4 months that had changed everything in ways she still didn't have the right language for. "Carter," she said. When you said yes that morning." She stopped. "What about it?" "I've wondered about it. I've wondered. You didn't ask me any questions. You didn't negotiate. You didn't think about it for a day and come back to me. You just said yes." She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a long time, longer than most people would have been comfortable with, but she had stopped measuring his silences against what other people would do. "Because I'd seen what Silas was doing," he said, finally. "And I'd watched you. Not closely. I'm not saying I was watching you. But I'd seen you around the county over the years. At the land office, at the market. I'd seen how you handled yourself, how you thought." He paused. "And when you came to my porch that morning with that speech prepared and your hands were shaking and you were going to say all of it anyway because you'd decided it needed to be said, I thought, this is someone worth saying yes to." Eliza was quiet. "It wasn't charity," Carter said, "and it wasn't rescue. You'd already worked out the legal solution yourself. You just needed someone to agree to it." He looked at the tree line. "I was glad to be the one you asked." She didn't know what to do with that. She was not, in general, a person who knew what to do with being seen accurately by another person. It was rarer than it should have been in her experience, and the rarity made it hard to receive without the instinct to deflect or qualify or make it smaller than it was. She didn't deflect. She let it sit. "Thank you," she said. The uncomplicated version. Carter nodded. He looked at the darkening tree line. "Beaumont will move soon," he said. "When he does, it's going to happen fast." "I know. Are you ready for that? For it to actually be over?" She considered the question honestly, the way he always seemed to create space for. Was she ready? She'd been at war with Silas Fenwick's intentions for most of her adult life, in one form or another, and the past 4 months had been the fullest expression of that war. Open, documented, fought in the light rather than managed in the quiet, careful way she'd been doing it for years. She had built a life around bracing for the next thing he was going to try. She had organized her choices, her habits, her days around the anticipation of his moves. What did it look like to live without that organizing principle? She genuinely didn't know. "I think I need to find out," she said. Carter looked at her with that not-quite smile that was the most warmth his face typically allowed itself. "That seems like a reasonable answer," he said. From inside the house, she could hear Pearl, who had apparently decided to make herself at home in the Lone Cedar kitchen while Eliza was away, which was exactly like Pearl, doing something that involved cast iron and sounded like supper being made with considerable authority. The cedar trees along the western boundary stood dark against the last light. Eliza breathed them in. Whatever came next, the trees were still standing. Everything Silas had sent against this place, the paperwork, the lawyers, the false claims, the men with kerosene in the dark, none of it had taken a single tree. They were still here. Her father's trees in her father's western stand, exactly where they had always been, older than the county itself, older than any of the small and human dramas playing out beneath them. That felt, in the moment, like something close enough to victory to stand on. She went inside to see what Pearl was making. Pearl's supper that night turned out to be a beef stew that she'd made with the confident authority of someone who had never once followed a written recipe in her life and considered the absence of one a point of personal pride. It was good, genuinely good, the kind of food that comes from instinct rather than instruction, heavy with root vegetables and something Pearl refused to identify that gave the broth a depth that Eliza couldn't quite name. They ate at the kitchen table, all five of them, Eliza, Carter, Pearl, Holt, and Dewey, which happened occasionally on evenings when the work had been hard and no one particularly wanted to be alone with their thoughts. It wasn't a tradition exactly, it was just what sometimes happened at Lone Cedar, and Eliza had come to understand that the ranch ran on those informal accumulations as much as it ran on schedules and tasks. Dewey talked more than everyone else combined, which was his nature, and no one held it against him. He'd been carrying the timber watch with the seriousness of someone who wanted to prove he was more than 19, and the events of the previous week had given him a story he clearly wanted to tell and was restraining himself from telling because he understood, imperfectly but genuinely, that it wasn't entirely his story to tell. Eliza appreciated the restraint even as she watched the effort it cost him. Holt ate and said nothing, which was Holt. Pearl refilled everyone's bowls without asking whether they wanted more, which was Pearl. Carter sat at the head of the table and ate and listened to Dewey's half-restrained story about the timber watch with the patience of a man who understood that 19-year-olds needed to feel like their participation mattered, because it had. Eliza sat in the middle of it and thought about her father's letter in her coat pocket and about Beaumont's words, days, not weeks, and about the particular quality of this moment, this table, this ordinary supper at the end of an extraordinary several months, and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not happiness exactly, more like the specific relief of someone who has been holding a door shut against a storm for so long that their arms have stopped knowing how to do anything else, and who is only now beginning to suspect that the storm might actually, genuinely, be ending. She didn't trust it completely. She'd learned not to trust endings until they were fully over, but she felt it, cautiously, the way you feel warmth returning to a hand that's been too cold, slowly, with pins and needles, not all at once. Beaumont moved on a Friday. Eliza wasn't there when it happened, which was probably how it needed to be, the law doing its work in its own channels, not requiring her presence to be valid. She heard about it the same afternoon from Drum Cooney, who appeared at the Lone Cedar Gate at 3 o'clock with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting to deliver news and has finally been given the opportunity. Silas Fenwick had been summoned to the courthouse that morning. Not asked, summoned, with a formal notice and a specific time. The kind of summons that left no room for the kind of polite declining that Beaumont's earlier approaches had permitted. 2 of the 3 men from the timber stand had, in fact, spoken to the judge's clerk. The youngest one had spoken first and most fully, which Eliza had suspected he might. She had looked at him in the lantern light and seen someone who had understood too late what he'd gotten himself into and was looking for the quickest exit from it. What he'd said had given Beaumont's inquiry the direct connection it had needed. Silas had not hired the men himself. Of course not. That was not how he operated. He was far too careful for that kind of directness. He had communicated through an intermediary, a business associate named Fletcher Gaines, who had been involved in several of the property transactions Beaumont's inquiry had been examining. Gaines, faced with the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of documentation and 2 witnesses placing his name in a specific conversation about a specific piece of land and a specific bottle of kerosene, had done what cornered intermediaries typically do. He had talked. And what he said, added to everything else Beaumont already had, was enough. What does it mean specifically? Carter asked, when Drum had finished and accepted the coffee. Pearl had materialized beside him with the efficiency of someone who viewed hospitality as a logistical problem to be solved. Criminal charges, Drum said. Conspiracy to commit arson for the timber business. And on the civil side, the property fraud inquiry, the false easement claim, the bad faith guardianship petition. Those are being referred to the county prosecutor. He paused. There's also some question about 2 other properties in the county where Silas used similar methods 10, 12 years ago, other people's land. The inquiry opened doors that weren't just about Eliza's situation. Eliza absorbed this. Other properties. Other people. A decade or more of the same quiet, methodical predation, operating just below the level where any individual instance could be acted on, until someone looked at the whole picture and saw the pattern. The other property owners, she said. Do they know? Beaumont is notifying them, Drum said. Some of them may have claims it's going to take time to sort out. She thought about that. About the people whose land had been taken by the same man using similar methods, years ago, before she'd been in a position to fight, before Beaumont had looked closely enough to see the pattern. Some of them had probably already lost what they'd lost permanently. The sorting out would come too late for some of it to matter. That was the part of this she hadn't let herself think about too directly during the months she'd been focused on her own situation. The other people. Silas hadn't started with her. She hadn't been the first. She'd been, as best she could tell, simply the first one who had been positioned to fight back effectively, and fighting back had created the conditions for everything else to be examined. That thought sat with her in a complicated way. She didn't know if it was something to feel proud of or just something to feel the full weight of. Drum left in the late afternoon. Pearl took the coffee cups. Dewey went to do the evening stable work with the focused energy of someone channeling a lot of feeling into a physical task. Holt went with him because that was what Holt did. Eliza and Carter sat with the quiet that remained. It's not over, Carter said. Not completely. Criminal charges take time. Civil proceedings take longer. I know. He'll have lawyers, the good ones, not the county firm. He has resources. I know that too. She looked at the table. But the shape of it has changed. Before he was the one with the power, and I was the one defending. Now he's defending, and I'm... She stopped. You're the record, Carter said. She looked at him. All those documents, he said, everything you filed, everything your father kept, everything Beaumont has been building for 6 weeks. You're the record of what he did. That doesn't go away regardless of how long the legal process takes. He held her gaze. That's what he was always trying to prevent. Not just losing the land, being on record as the man he actually is. She hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms, but it was right. Silas had operated for decades in the space between what was provable and what was merely suspected, maintaining a version of himself, responsible family member, sound businessman, community presence, that bore almost no relationship to his actual methods. The record dismantled that version. Whatever happened with the charges, whatever the courts ultimately decided about individual incidents, the record existed now. People in Dalton County knew. Adeline Marsh knew. Beaumont knew. Drum Cooney knew. And Drum Cooney knowing meant everyone Drum talked to would know, which in a county this size meant essentially everyone. Silas Fenwick could no longer be what he had always appeared to be. That was, she realized, probably the most significant thing. Not the legal outcome, though that mattered. The unmasking, the end of the performance. She went to see Silas. Carter didn't tell her not to. He asked her once if she was sure, in the tone of someone who is checking. The decision is actually hers and not a reaction to adrenaline or accumulated anger. And when she said she was sure, he said all right and didn't add anything else. That was the thing about him she had come to rely on most. The willingness to let her be the authority on her own choices, even when he might have preferred a different one. She rode into town on a Tuesday morning, 9 days after Beaumont's summons, and went to the house where Silas had been living since his own property outside the county had been placed under some kind of legal hold she didn't fully understand yet and didn't need to. His lawyer had negotiated an arrangement that allowed him to remain in Dalton County pending the proceedings. He wasn't going anywhere. The house was a rented place on the eastern edge of town, smaller than the kind of house Silas typically occupied, with a front porch that had one step loose and a window that needed new putty around the frame. The small deteriorations of a man whose resources were now directed elsewhere. She noticed them without satisfaction. or mostly without satisfaction. He answered the door himself, which meant his staff had gone, or he'd sent them away, or they'd made their own calculations about proximity to a man in his current situation. He looked older, not dramatically. He wasn't a different person, but the particular quality of authority he'd always carried, the settled certainty that the world arranged itself according to his intentions, was absent. What was left without it was just a man in a house that wasn't his, in a town that was reconsidering what it thought of him. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. She went in. They sat in the front room because there was no other option that didn't involve a kitchen with dirty dishes that neither of them wanted to navigate, and the room was cold because the fire hadn't been tended properly. Silas didn't offer her anything. She didn't expect him to. "I'm not here to gloat," she said. She needed to say that first because it was true, and because he needed to hear it before anything else she said could mean what she needed it to mean. "Then why are you here?" His voice was the same. Whatever else had changed, the voice hadn't. Still measured, still carrying the residue of decades of being listened to. "Because I've been trying to work out what I wanted to say to you for a long time," she said. "And I think I finally know." He watched her with the flat assessing quality she'd spent years being afraid of. It didn't frighten her now. It was just a look, made up by a person, and it meant exactly as much as she decided it meant. "My father knew what you were," she said. "He wrote it down, 4 years before he died, in a letter he never sent you. He knew you were going to come after the land. He didn't stop you in advance because he thought confrontation would accelerate things, and he was probably right about that." She kept her voice even. "But he left me everything I needed to stop you myself, every document, every note, every record. He trusted me to find it and use it." Silas said nothing. "What I want you to understand," she said, "is that you didn't lose because of Carter Voss, or because of Judge Beaumont's inquiry, or because of any piece of luck. You lost because my father spent 30 years documenting everything, and I spent the last 3 years continuing what he started. And when you came at me with everything you had, the record was already there." She paused. "You never had a chance. You just didn't know it yet." Something moved across his face. Not remorse. She hadn't come here expecting remorse and wouldn't have trusted it if she'd gotten it. Something closer to the particular bitterness of a man who has arrived too late at a real accounting. "You're more like him than I gave you credit for," Silas said. It was not a compliment exactly, but it wasn't quite an insult either. It was something in between. The honest assessment of a man who had fundamentally underestimated someone and was now in the wreckage of that mistake. "Yes," Eliza said. "I am." She stood. There was nothing else she needed from this room, from this man, from this conversation. She had come to say the thing, and she had said it, and the saying of it had done what she'd needed it to do. Not for him, for herself. Closed something, named something, put the period at the end of the sentence so the sentence could finally be finished. "The legal process is going to take as long as it takes," she said at the door. "I won't be involved in it beyond what's required of me. My property will be managed as it always has been, and Lone Cedar will be what it's always been." She looked at him one last time. "I hope you find some way to be honest about what you've done, not for my sake, for whatever is left of yours." She left. She pulled the door shut behind her, not hard, just closed. Outside, the spring morning was doing what spring in this country did when it was finally committed, warm and clear, and carrying the smell of wet earth and cedar and everything that had survived the winter doing what surviving things do, which was grow. She stood on Silas Fenwick's porch with its loose step and breathed it in. Then she got on her horse and rode home. The weeks that followed had a quality she hadn't experienced in so long, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Ordinary. The weeks felt ordinary in the best possible sense of the word, not flattened, not empty, but grounded in the regular rhythm of work and weather and meals and the accumulation of days that weren't organized around crisis. The calving season finished, and they'd had better outcomes than the previous year. The eastern pasture fence held through a late storm that came through in April with the rudeness of weather that hadn't read the seasonal calendar. Pearl identified 3 good prospects at a horse sale in the county seat that Carter approved on her recommendation, which Pearl accepted with the specific satisfaction of someone whose expertise has been formally recognized, though she didn't say so in those words. Dewey turned 20 in late April, and Pearl made a cake that was structurally ambitious and partially successful, which Dewey declared the best cake he'd ever eaten, which may or may not have been true, but was absolutely the right thing to say. Eliza went to her property every week. She walked the timber stands with the same attention she'd been giving them since the night of the kerosene bottle. Not from fear anymore, but from the growing understanding that paying attention to a thing was how you kept it. The western cedars were exactly what Pearl had said they were: old, dense, worth protecting not because of their market value, but because of what they represented about the patience of growing things, and the lengths a person should go to in order to give that patience room. She had been thinking about the timber differently since the night she'd stood in it with Carter and Holt and Pearl in the lantern light. Before, the timber had been the target, what Silas wanted, the reason for the fight, the thing she was defending. Now, with the fight receding into legal proceedings that she checked in on but didn't drive, it was becoming what it had always been underneath all of that: her father's careful stewardship, her inheritance, a piece of living land that asked nothing of her except not to be destroyed. She found she liked it in a simpler way than she'd allowed herself to for years. Liked standing in it. Liked the smell of cedar and cold soil. Liked the particular silence of old trees, which was different from other silences. Fuller, somehow, the way things that have been alive for a very long time are full in ways that recently arrived things aren't. She started a notebook. Not for legal purposes. She had those, she kept those. That habit was permanent and she accepted it. This was different. She wrote observations, which sections were healthiest, where the light came through best, what the undergrowth looked like, and how it changed through the season. Pearl had said you could log this sustainably and fund the ranch for a decade, and Eliza was beginning to think seriously about what that would look like. Not the destruction Silas had planned, strip logging with no thought for what came after, but something careful, something her father might have considered if he'd had more years and more security. She showed Carter the notebook one evening without quite planning to. She'd left it on the kitchen table and he'd picked it up with a questioning look, and she'd nodded. He read through it without hurrying, set it down. "You're thinking about selective logging," he said. "Thinking about it," she said. "Not for a while, but thinking." Pearl knows timber. Pearl knows everything, according to Pearl. In this case, she might actually be right, Carter said, and there was something in his voice that she'd been noticing more over the past weeks. A loosening, a slight increase in the dry humor that had always been there but had been held close. He was comfortable in a way that she thought probably meant she was comfortable, the two things being connected in ways that neither of them had articulated yet. They were working up to it. She knew they were working up to it. It had been accumulating in the small things, the way he'd started waiting at the table until she sat down before he began eating, not announced, just done. The way she'd stopped explaining herself when she made decisions about her property, not because she'd given up autonomy, but because the explanation had stopped being necessary. The way the second coffee mug was just hers now, a settled fact, like the crack in the kitchen plaster, or the loose board on the second porch step that both of them stepped over automatically without discussing. She didn't want to rush whatever it was. She'd rushed the marriage, circumstance had required it, and the pace of everything since had been dictated by Silas's moves and her responses. She wanted this particular thing to take the time it needed to take without anyone's hand forcing it. But she was aware of it. She thought Carter was aware of it. And being aware of something together, even without naming it, was its own kind of beginning. The formal legal resolution came in stages, the way these things do. The first stage arrived in late May, when the county prosecutor's office formally filed charges against Silas Fenwick and Fletcher Gaines in connection with the attempted arson at the timber stand. Eliza received a notification, read it, filed it in the folder she kept for legal correspondence, and went back to the fence section she'd been mending. The second stage came in June, a civil ruling on the pattern of property fraud the inquiry had documented. Two of the properties involved in Silas's earlier dealings were identified in the ruling. Their former owners, or their heirs, were notified of potential remedies. Eliza read about this in a document Beaumont sent her directly, with a covering note in his particular precise handwriting. "Your records were foundational to this finding. Your father's documentation extended our reach by a decade." She read the note twice and put it with the letter her father had written. The third stage, the one she hadn't expected or hadn't let herself expect, came in July, when Silas withdrew from Dalton County entirely. He didn't announce it. That wasn't his way. Announcement and ceremony. He simply was there, and then was not there. The rented house on the eastern edge of town was vacant. His lawyer filed a change of address notice with the court, rerouting correspondence to an office in a county 300 miles south. Whatever remained of his social presence in Dalton County, the business associations, the county connections he'd spent decades building, had already been quietly dissolving since Beaumont's inquiry became common knowledge. Eliza found out from Adeline Marsh, which was how she found out most things of this nature. "He's gone," Adeline said, without preamble, on a Monday morning when Eliza came in to file a routine property record update. "Gone where?" "South by the filing. Whether he stays there depends on how the charges proceed." Adeline stamped Eliza's document with her customary precision. "I've been in this office for 30 years. I've watched men like him operate in this county for most of that time. They don't disappear. They relocate. But their reach shortens considerably when they can't walk into a room and be who they were." Eliza took her document. "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" "It's supposed to be honest," Adeline said, "which I thought you'd prefer." "I do," Eliza said. "Thank you, Adeline." She went outside and stood on the street and let the news arrange itself into its proper shape in her mind. He was gone. The charges would continue to proceed through the legal machinery at whatever pace that machinery set. Fletcher Gaines was cooperating with prosecutors. The two witnesses from the timber stand were part of the record. There would be hearings and filings, and the grinding administrative process of justice moving in a county legal system that had other business to conduct alongside this particular case. Silas might face significant consequences. He might, through lawyers and delays and the various mechanisms available to men with resources, manage to minimize them. But he was gone from here. Gone from the county where her father had built something and she had defended it. Gone from the proximity that had made every morning feel like waiting for the next move. The legal proceedings would continue to require things of her, and she would provide them, and she would continue to keep the records the way her father had kept them. Because that habit was correct regardless of whether there was an active threat. Because the whole point was that you maintained the record before you needed it, so it was there when you did. She understood that now, in a way that had moved from intellectual to cellular, the kind of understanding that doesn't require reminding. But the man himself was gone. And that particular weight, specific and personal, the weight of a lifetime of his intentions pressing against everything she tried to build, that was gone with him. She breathed the July air and felt the lightness of it. She planted the cedar saplings on a Saturday in late July, which would not have been her first choice of timing. Late July in Dalton County was pushing the edge of good planting season. But Pearl had found them at a nursery in the next county, and the timing was what it was. It had started, as many things at Lone Cedar started, with a practical observation. There was a section along the western boundary of Eliza's property where the old trees were thinner, not logged, just the natural variation in how a stand grows, some sections denser than others. Pearl had pointed it out during one of their rides and said, offhandedly, that it was the kind of gap that would benefit from new growth if anyone were interested in the long-term health of the stand. Eliza had been interested. She'd mentioned it to Carter, who had said that sounded like something worth doing. And somehow between Pearl finding the nursery, Holt acquiring a truck cart to transport the saplings, and Carter spending a morning marking the appropriate spacing in the gap section, it had become a Saturday project that all 5 of them were participating in. They were cedar saplings, obviously, about 18 inches tall, each one, bundled in burlap with root balls intact. Eliza had read about the planting requirements, and then double-checked with Pearl, who had grown up in Oregon Territory and knew more about conifers than anyone had a right to expect from a horse manager on a cattle ranch. "Deep enough that the root ball sits below the frost line," Pearl said, for approximately the 3rd time, watching Dewey dig. "Not deeper, deep enough." "I know what deep enough means," Dewey said without looking up. "You didn't know what it meant the first time I said it." "I learned." "Good." Holt was working 20 feet away, digging with the efficient economy of motion that characterized everything he did. He'd already planted 4 of the 12 saplings assigned to his section. Dewey had planted 2 and was working on his 3rd. Carter was at the far end of the gap, and Eliza was working her way toward the middle. The soil in the gap was good. She could feel it, the particular texture of forest floor soil that had been building up under old trees for a very long time. It gave way easily under the shovel, dark and rich, the kind of ground that grew things well. Her father had known this about the western stand. It was probably part of why he'd never logged it. She planted the sapling carefully, the way she'd planted everything in her life that mattered. With attention, with patience, with the understanding that the result wouldn't be visible for years, and you planted it anyway. These trees would not be mature in her lifetime. She knew that. A cedar sapling planted today would be a modest but established tree in 30 years and a proper old-growth contributor in 100. She would not see them reach the size of the trees standing around her now. Her children would not see it, if she had children, and their children might see the beginning of it. She planted them anyway. That seemed important to understand about certain kinds of work. The work that benefits from being done even when the person doing it will never see the full result. Her father had protected the western stand for 30 years. He had kept the records and written the notes in the back of ledgers and planted the legal documentation that would protect the land after he was gone, and he'd done all of it knowing he wouldn't be there to see whether it held. It had held. She was the evidence of that. So she planted the saplings for whoever came after, which was the only response she knew to having been the recipient of that kind of forward-looking care. Carter appeared at her side at midday, when the heat had climbed enough that working in the full sun was getting unpleasant. He had dirt on his hands and on the knees of his trousers from kneeling to set the root balls, and his hat was pushed back in the way it went when he'd been working hard. "Last one," he said, handing her a sapling still wrapped in burlap. She took it. They were standing at the center of the gap now, the point where their two sections met. The planted saplings stretched out on either side of them, small and new and precise in their spacing, already part of the place even though they were barely started. She knelt and began opening the hole for the last one. Carter knelt beside her. Not because she needed help, she didn't, and he knew it, but because it was the last one and it was the one at the center. And it seemed like the kind of thing that two people who had been working on the same thing for the same reasons might do together. They set the root ball. They filled in around it. They pressed the soil firmly with their hands, the way Pearl had demonstrated 3 times, making sure there were no air pockets. When they were done, they were both still crouching, looking at the sapling. 18 inches of future cedar, planted at the center of a gap in a stand of old-growth trees that a man had spent several months trying to destroy and had failed to destroy. "My father would have liked this," Eliza said. "I think he would have liked a lot of things about the past several months," Carter said. She looked at him. I was looking at the sapling, not at her, which made it easier to receive what he'd said directly, without the instinct to deflect. "He would have liked you," she said. Carter was quiet for a moment. "That matters to you." "It does." "Good," he said. And then, after a pause that was exactly the length it needed to be, "I would have liked him too." Pearl called from somewhere to the north that it was time to eat and that she'd left sandwiches on the cart, and that if Dewey ate hers again, she was going to use his saddle for spare leather. Dewey's distant protest of innocence was not entirely convincing. Eliza laughed. Carter stood and offered her his hand, not because she needed it, but because it was there, and she took it and stood, and neither of them made anything of it except what it was. 2 people getting up off the ground, their hands dirty from planting something together. They walked out of the timber stand into the open where the sun was full and warm, and the cart was sitting in the shade of a big cedar at the boundary, and Pearl was already distributing sandwiches with the authority of someone who has decided that the catering aspects of this operation are under her jurisdiction now. Holt ate standing up. Dewey sat on the ground. Pearl sat on the cart with her feet hanging. Carter and Eliza sat on the fallen log at the boundary edge that had been there so long it was more like furniture than debris. Eliza looked at the timber, at the new saplings barely visible from here among the old trees, and felt the full and uncomplicated length of everything that had happened since the morning she'd walked up a stranger's porch steps with a prepared speech and shaking hands and been answered before she could finish the first sentence. She had come here with nothing but necessity. She had come here because she had no other option, because the county's legal framework and her uncle's particular brand of predation had converged to create a situation where a desperate arrangement with a man she barely knew was the most rational solution available. What she had found instead, or what had grown, unglamorous and sideways and full of friction and ordinary difficulty, into something she had not planned and could not have anticipated, was this. This table she ate breakfast at. These people who had become, without announcement, the fabric of her daily life. This land that was both hers and connected to Carter's in ways that were going to take years to fully understand. This man sitting beside her on a fallen log, eating a sandwich that Pearl had made without a recipe, who had said yes before she finished asking and had never once tried to make that yes into a debt. She had always known what she was capable of. She'd known it in the way a person knows a fact they've been told, intellectually, without having had occasion to prove it. The past 5 months had been the proving, not just the legal victories, though those were real, not just the documents and the records and the courtroom moments, and Silas's face when the guardianship petition was dismissed, and Marcus Vale sitting across from her certified copies, and the 3 men in the timber stand encountering a boundary they hadn't expected to find. All of that was real and hard-won, and she would not minimize it. But it was something else, too. It was finding out that when you stopped managing yourself to fit someone else's idea of what you could handle, when you stopped preemptively shrinking to avoid the threat of being diminished, when you simply showed up and did what the situation required with everything you actually had, it was finding out that you had considerably more than you'd been led to believe. Her father had known it. He'd written it in a letter he never sent. She is more capable than she has been allowed to know. She knew it now. "Carter," she said. She kept her eyes on the timber. "What is this?" She felt him look at her sideways. "What's what?" "This." She gestured, not specifically, at the log they were sitting on, at the ranch behind them, at the space between them that had been narrowing for months in ways neither of them had rushed. "Whatever we're doing, whatever we've been building, I'd like to name it." He was quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet. Thinking quiet. "I'm not sure I'm good at naming things," he said finally. "You're better at it than you give yourself credit for." Another pause. "I think it's whatever you want it to be," he said. "That's not a deflection. I mean that my preference is clear enough. But I want it to be what you choose, not what the situation chose for you back in March." She turned and looked at him directly. The afternoon sun was coming over his shoulder, and he looked the way he always looked, unremarkable from a distance, something else entirely up close. A person whose surface told you almost nothing about the interior and whose interior was worth the patience it took to learn. "In March," she said, "I was choosing a legal solution. What I'm choosing now is different." He looked at her. "I'm choosing you," she said. "Not the arrangement, you." The silence that followed was the longest he'd allowed himself in her company. Long enough that Pearl, from the direction of the cart, said something to Holt that made Holt make the sound he made when something was marginally amusing, which was as close to a laugh as Holt got. "All right," Carter said. It came out the same way he'd said yes on his porch that March morning. Quiet, simple, without excess. The same word, but carrying something different now. Something decided rather than offered. Something that had been waiting the appropriate amount of time for both of them to be ready for it. "All right," Eliza said. It was not a grand declaration. It was not a scene designed for anyone watching. It was 2 imperfect, stubborn, tired, capable people sitting on a log at the edge of a timber stand in the afternoon sun, agreeing to the thing they'd already been becoming. Pearl chose that moment to announce that if everyone was finished with their sandwiches, she'd like to know, because there was still afternoon work to be done, and the horses weren't going to feed themselves. And the moment broke back into the ordinary with the specific graciousness of ordinary things that know when to arrive. Late that evening, when the work was done and the horses were fed and the saplings were settled into their new soil and the long summer day was finally releasing into dark, Eliza walked the boundary of her property alone. She did this sometimes, not out of vigilance anymore, or not only that, but because the land was hers in a way she understood now at a level below the legal, below the documented, below the strategic. It was hers the way her father's handwriting was hers. Something she had been given and had then made her own through the work of keeping it. She walked the full perimeter. The eastern edge where the timber thinned, the southern fence line that Holt and Dewey had repaired. The western boundary with its old cedars and its new saplings, small shapes in the dusk that would be here when everything else about this season was memory. The northern corner where her father had put the first boundary stone when he bought the land, and which Pratt the surveyor had confirmed was exactly where it had always been. She stood at that northern stone for a while. She thought about her father, as she often did here. Not with the grief that used to accompany the thinking, not that it was gone, But it had become less the main thing and more the background of the main thing, which was the continuance. The thing kept going. That was what he'd wanted, and it was going. She thought about Carter on the log in the afternoon sun saying, all right, the same way he'd said yes on a March morning, and the long, specific arc from that morning to this evening, and what it meant that something begun in desperation could end in something she was willing to call chosen. Not all desperate beginnings ended this way. She knew that. She wasn't sentimental enough to think that necessity reliably produced good outcomes, or that the fact of surviving a hard thing meant the hard thing had been worth it in any simple sense. Some people fought for what was theirs and still lost it. Some people found the documents too late. Some people found themselves alone at the northern cornerstone with no one to go back to. She had not been those people. She didn't know entirely why. Luck and preparation, and Carter Voss saying yes, and Adeline Marsh knowing where everything was, and Pearl being from Oregon Territory, and Holt being exactly as reliable as he appeared, and Drum Cooney knowing everything worth knowing, and Dewey trying hard enough to make up for his 19 years. She didn't know which of those things had been decisive and which had been supportive, and she suspected the question was unanswerable and probably didn't need answering. What she knew was simpler. The land was hers. The record was clean. The trees were standing. The man who had spent years trying to erase what her father built was 300 miles south and getting further, in every sense, from the kind of power he'd once had here. And Lone Cedar Ranch had a light on in the kitchen because someone was waiting for her to come back. She walked home. The gate was the same gate she'd pushed open on a sunrise morning in March, with a prepared speech and shaking hands, and a plan made of equal parts legal logic and pure stubbornness. She pushed it open again now, and it made the same sound it had always made, the iron hinge that needed oil and never quite got it. She went up the porch steps. The second one from the top was still loose. Carter was going to fix it, or she was going to fix it. She knew how. Inside, the lamp was lit, and the coffee cups were already out for morning, and her papers were stacked in their corner of the table the way they'd been stacked for months, her handwriting continuing where her father's had left off. She sat down at the table. Outside, the cedar trees stood in the dark, old and new, the grown ones and the saplings, the long work of decades and the beginning of the next decades. And they did what they had always done, and what they would continue to do long after anyone alive tonight was gone. They grew.